We are at the top of the hour, and a few more people might trickle in here, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the Zoom controls, particularly finding, locating the chat box, which we can use to send out information to you all, but also you can type your questions into that chat box at any point along the way here. And we'll kind of go ahead and get started here. Catherine, if you can, next slide, please. So this is part of the NAGT webinar series. So thank you for attending, and NAGT is sponsoring a comprehensive webinar series that is going to be your one-stop shop for strengthening work in Earth education. Webinars vary in topics featuring novel and innovative work in Earth education research and pedagogy, new teaching materials, classroom and professional experiences from all the people like you. And the webinar series is free, as you are currently attending, and we encourage you to invite your colleagues and to kind of spread the word and join the discussion along the way. There's lots of links in this page, and we'll, which you may have already found your way to in terms of the upcoming schedule and the archives, because all of the webinars are recorded, including this one, and so you can always go back to them at any point. And so there's already over 100 different webinars historically that have been archived, and so you can go and check all of those out, as well as the other sponsoring projects and programs that are a part of the webinar series. And so today we are focusing, we can go to the next slide, please, on Advocacy 101, engaging policymakers and promoting the inclusion of a geoscience perspective. So I'm really excited to have Mike and Catherine here today, and I will turn it over to them to introduce themselves and take it from here.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. So this is Catherine. Welcome everyone to the Advocacy 101 webinar. I'm really pleased to be presenting this with my colleague, Mike. We're gonna switch on and off here a little bit. So I'll kick things off. We also are gonna try the awkward thing of making this somewhat interactive. It's awkward because webinars are sort of in a format that's inherently not interactive, but make sure that you know where that chat window is. So you should have a control bar either at the top or the bottom of your screen, and you can find the chat window there. So there'll be a couple of prompts partway through the webinar today where we'll ask for your responses. So we really appreciate the active participation that you'll do. Okay, so today is really an overview of how to engage policymakers and promote a geoscience perspective in policymaking. What we wanted to start off with is a quick poll, which I think Andrew will put up here. So just to give us a sense of what your experience is in advocacy. And this is kind of hierarchical. Also, all of these are valued activities. We want you to choose the first one that is relevant for you. Have you actually been an organizer of advocacy efforts, participated in efforts? Do you have ideas for the advocacy you want to do, but you haven't implemented them yet? Or are you new at NEW, not KNEW, new to thinking about advocacy? So go ahead and choose the one that makes the most sense for you and hit submit. All right, so that's great. It looks like we have a real mix here of 44% who have organized, and then a third of us who have participated, and then there are a bunch who are new to thinking about advocacy. So thank you, that helps us gauge where you're coming from as we think about this. So a real mix of things, and that's fine. Hopefully you'll find something useful in this regardless of your perspective. So our goals for today are here on the screen. One really large goal is just to make sure that you are all aware of the resources that NAGT offers for advocacy in a geoscience or geoscience education perspective. And these resources can be used at a variety of different levels, federal, state, and local, but they're there, and both Mike and I want to make sure that they're being used to their fullest extent We will also be talking about just general ideas for how to make sure that you are having the biggest impact you can on the policy decisions that you're most interested in. And so there are strategies that really transcend just geoscience advocacy, and we'll talk a little bit about those, how to communicate with elected officials, what are the ways to do that effectively, whether it's letters or presentations or testimony or what have you. And then finally, we want to tap into your knowledge and hear from you about what you'd like to have in terms of resources from NAGT, because ultimately this organization is about elevating your work, and so we want to make sure that we're offering the resources that will help make that happen the most effectively. Okay, so with that, let me just give you a brief introduction so you have a sense of where I'm coming from, and Mike will then introduce himself. So I am at Princeton University. I am in a science and engineering education group there, but by training I am a geomorphologist, and so my geoscience research is in how landscapes change through time, especially as climate changes, and so I have the privilege of traveling to beautiful places, mostly in the Rocky Mountains, so Glacier National Park in the top view, and Mountainous River in the Bighorn Range in Wyoming. In my scientific science and engineering education world, we're really engaged in how to improve scientific literacy for all students. And so that doesn't make for as compelling pictures. I don't have a picture for that, but that's where my group at Princeton spends most of its time. In terms of my advocacy, I wanted to just highlight 3 different types of experiences that I can share with you. One is that NAGT has an advocacy committee, and as of this fiscal year, academic year, I am the chair of that committee. And so again, I have a big vested interest in hearing from all of you what you would like that committee, specifically in NAGT more broadly, to be doing in this realm. I am also one of the founding members of a grassroots organization called Indivisible Garden State Values. For those of you unfamiliar with the Indivisible movement, this came about in the end of 2016 following the last presidential election, really as a guide for how to kickstart grassroots advocacy. And so the Indivisible Guide was a blueprint for how the Tea Party gained disproportionate power so that people of all different political walks could make use of those strategies. And so we are a group of about 500 people in Western New Jersey, and our biggest success so far has been, from a partisan perspective, flipping our district last year from red to blue. That said, we are a nonpartisan group and include plenty of members who are in both political parties or independents, and our goal is really to have a lot of dialogue across the aisle. The last thing that I want to highlight here is that I'm an elected official, so I'm a member of my local Board of Education, and that comes with its own aspects of advocacy. So you can see the middle picture there, me and my spouse as I was running for office last year. And that's an excellent way to make an impact, whether it's on the local scale or running for a bigger stage position. Okay, so with that, Mike can introduce himself.
Yeah, so I'm Mike Phillips. I've been at Illinois Valley Community College for, I'm in my 22nd year now. I'm also a geomorphologist, so maybe there's a theme there. I studied superficial processes. I actually did a Martian analog study for my master's thesis. When I graduated, I went to work in environmental geology. So I was investigating hazardous waste sites under a contract with the US EPA. And once you start working in superficial processes, natural hazards, and then environmental geology, you start to get very interested in how people interact with the earth. So my connection there kind of moves into geology and society, and what are people doing and why are they doing it that way, and why are they doing things that to a geologist would seem like a really bad idea. And that got me more into geoscience outreach, like how do we share our message with different groups of people. There's a picture down there of me sharing with a group of school kids at a field day when I worked for the State Geological Survey, and you can go to the next slide. And so then that led to, or that linked up with my interest that I already had in political things. I ran for the local school board and ultimately served as the school board president for 12 years, and I was on the board for 16. I ran for, not on this list, I ran for a state representative at one point. I live in a very Republican district and I'm a Democrat, but I just couldn't stop myself. Some people just feel that urge. But when I did that, I got to meet a lot of people who were in elected office at the state level, both Republicans and Democrats. And one thing that I discovered across the board was this interest in technical expertise. In my case, because I was a geologist, somebody who knows about flooding, somebody who knows about groundwater and groundwater contamination. So some other roles that I've served in, I'm a precinct committee person, which is an elected position in Illinois at the party level. In fact, this evening at 6:30, I'll be at the the monthly meeting of the LaSalle County Democrats. And so there will be other precinct committee people there, folks running for office. So that kind of keeps me involved. I'm the former chair of NAGT's Advocacy Committee. I served on Geological Society of America's Geology and Public Policy Committee. And and I also head up the voter registration drive at my college. So all those things kind of keep me involved and active, and also allow me to share some of the things that I understand as a geologist that maybe other folks don't necessarily understand, but would like to have that information. So. I can't remember if it's me or is that
it's still you, Mike.
So when I was on the advocacy committee, initially it was an ad hoc committee, and we wrote up this charge to the NAGT advocacy committee and created it as a permanent committee that reports to the executive committee of the NAGT. So this Don Duganhaus, if any of you know him, was also part of that early effort. We initially had sort of an email group, but like I said, that has become the official NAGT Advocacy Committee, which works with the executive committee to try to advocate on behalf of geoscience educators. So, and the principles that were approved at the development of that are to serve NAGT's mission, and the mission is twofold. So it's education and geoscience. So we want to make sure that the geoscience educators are supported in their advocacy efforts, and sometimes that is kind of promoting the education side, good educational practices and grants and other things that support us as educators. And sometimes it's more on the geoscience side, making sure that policy reflects good geoscience, like what we know about the earth, what we understand about the earth, And where those two merge very often would be things like teaching evolution or teaching about climate change. Sometimes the teaching of those things that we know to be good science can become controversial. And so as the NAGT, we want to make sure that, that our members are supported when they do that. So why advocate? Well, I think to me, when I go back to my personal history, like I said, in too many cases, I've noticed where public policy doesn't necessarily reflect what we know and what we understand as geoscience or geoscientists. And sometimes public policy can get in the way of educators. And we can discuss that a little bit more as we go on, but to me, those are the two driving forces, is to help people who are in the public policy realm understand what our perspective is and why our perspective is what it is. So one of the things that I think we'll talk about a little bit today is that policymakers come from whatever their own background is. So when I served on the school board, I was the scientist on the school board, and I was the educator on the school board. We also had somebody who worked in catering, so that person was kind of the go-to person when it came to questions involving what's going on in the cafeteria. And the cafeteria inspection, there were some issues with that. That person, everybody looked to the caterer who ran a commercial kitchen to answer those questions. Our board had a state police officer. So when there were questions about security and safety, everybody looked to that person. So likewise, when there were questions about science and education, very often the board would look to me to provide some insight on what the issue was, what the teachers might be thinking, or how this worked out in terms of science. So could you click again, please? So under the why, that perception part, we can help shape people's perception of the issue. They might come into it thinking it's one thing, and then if they talk to somebody that they recognize as an expert or who more clearly understands that issue, you can actually change people's perceptions. And voter expectations are based on perceptions. So making sure that we're out there providing people with good information can actually change the expectations of the other people that we encounter, not just the policymakers, but the people who are voting on issues. So even if you're not on a school board, if you go to a school board meeting and introduce yourself, who you are and what your background is, you can actually impact the people that are in the room. And if it happens to be a meeting where there's press, sometimes the folks in the press will come and ask you more questions and try to find out more details. As I mentioned, we represent, as geoscience educators, some overlapping constituency groups. Educators, K through 12, higher education. Many of us are involved in informal education as well. So kind of bringing that educational viewpoint to the table. On the science side, sometimes you're the only scientist in the room. So in addition to being the earth scientist, you're also the scientist. And so bringing that voice, and people, generally speaking, still place a lot of trust in folks who study science and who kind of understand the language of science and how it works. And then within the geosciences, many of us have some very specific lines that we're especially interested in. So I'm especially interested in natural hazards. Flooding is a big issue in my area. We're not, our college is right next to the Illinois River, we're up on a bluff, but flooding is a big issue for the area. I actually serve on a couple of flood resilience coalitions that local legislators have set up. And we might have other interests as well, like environmental issues. So you can kind of think about which constituency groups you belong to and you represent. And what happens in the state and national capital does impact us. So we are affected by laws and rules. We are affected by changes in funding. And we are impacted when the public focuses its attention on our area or when the focus moves into another direction. So there are just a lot of potential impacts that we can influence. We can't necessarily control them, but having that influence, I think, is very important. And the last bullet I have here is the language barrier. One of the things that I have noticed throughout my career is that one of the reasons that what we know as scientists and geoscientists, one of the reasons that does not end up in public policy is because the people making policy don't understand it. So when we go to a conference or if we read research papers, it's written in a certain way that may not make a lot of sense to somebody coming in from the policy side whose background could be in political science, but very often if you talk to lawmakers and staffers, their backgrounds are just all over the place. They could come in as business people, or who knows what major they could have had in college. Very often it's not science. And so to have somebody who can help them understand the language of science can be extremely helpful. So that's kind of my background on why. So our discussion question, things that you can type in some answers to so I can be quiet for a moment. What policy issues do you think would benefit from a geoscience educator perspective, which is probably your perspective? So, and you can type those into the chat. That would be a good place to share that.
All right, so we'll wait a few minutes for folks to participate. So this is your chance. If Mike mentioned a couple of different issues that are of interest to the advocacy group, but if there are things that are of particular interest to you, this is a chance to share them, just so that we have some common sense of what the full scope is that of issues that you might advocate about. Okay, so we have responses about energy transition, green infrastructure, absolutely climate resiliency, water rights and regulations. If you are from an area with coal mining, mountaintop mining, that's clearly a big issue. So in parentheses there, the stream protection rule, climate change again, and how that might relate to extreme weather events, or simply, as Mike said, natural disasters, including extreme weather events, whether that's tied to climate change or not. Any others?
And that's a good list. And I think one of the things to mention about this is if you want to advocate, you are absolutely the best advocate for something that you feel strongly about. It might be your research area, and it could just be something that you personally feel strongly about for any of a variety of reasons. But the things that you're very interested in are very good things to focus on when you advocate, because that passion can come through, and also your depth of understanding can come through as well.
Absolutely. So let me just add one category that's not in here yet, but maybe on your mind, certainly is on Mike and my minds, which is education specific ones. So advocacy related to next generation science standards. If you are someone who is frustrated that geosciences are not taught widespread across high schools, then that would be something that you could potentially advocate about. Resources for education institutions, all of those things are sort of on the education side of geoscience education, that are all equally valid for you to be advocating for. Okay, so with that, let's transition into thinking about how to advocate. And Mike has really set the groundwork for thinking about this on many, many different dimensions. So let me put on my indivisible hat for a second, because one of the things that that group really tries to stress is that you are a constituent, and your elected representatives, although we want to believe that everyone is in office for virtuous reasons, they are also in office to get reelected. And that if you as a constituent make them feel a little bit uncomfortable about whether they have your support or not, you can really move the needle on that. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to sort of make that impact in just a little bit. As I mentioned, I'm in a district that did flip in 2018 from an incumbent Republican to now a Democratic representative. And part of our advocacy leading up to that was going to our Republican representatives' town halls and making sure that he understood that we were upset with his environmental record in particular. And his record changed. And you can see that in the data that from before 2017 to after 2017, we really moved the needle on that. Of course, that, you know, it's not just about re-election, but they hopefully also care about doing a good job, and you are a professional with specific expertise. So it's not just that you have a vote that can move the needle, but you also have, as Mike said, the language that can help translate what's happening in the world of expertise in geosciences, in education. You can help be a emissary for those ideas to your elected representatives. And so, you know, if they care about doing a good job, then you have credibility as one of the subject matter experts. The third is as an elected official, and obviously this is a much more direct way to advocate. So, you know, rather than trying to be a persuader for someone who represents you, there are a lot of efforts underway to try to move people with a STEM background into elected office. And Mike alluded to this, particularly at the upper levels of the US government. There are very few elected officials who have a science or engineering background. The previous representative for the Princeton area, Rush Holt, his tagline was, his supporters' tagline was, "My representative is a rocket scientist." But it was notable because he was one of the few scientists actually in Congress. And so you as, again, you can take your expertise into positions, whether it's education or town council or county level, state level, national level. And then finally, you know, the first three bullets are really about talking to elected officials or becoming an elected official, but we shouldn't forget that part of advocacy can come from simply talking to neighbors. And that is the essence of grassroots movements. There are a ton of community organizations, whether it is your public library or whether it is nonprofit groups, lobbying groups, who have meetings that are meant to inform the public. And so you can be a volunteer at those and give an hour-long talk on what's up with climate change, why we should protect our streams from mountaintop removal waste. You can be talking directly to people who will then exercise their rights as constituents, as professionals themselves. Okay, so we're going to turn this back to you then. That's kind of a general sense of how to advocate from a perspective of the position that you might take, the role that you might play. But I want to put another discussion question to you, which is, what is the most effective mechanism, or really what is the strategy then for advocating? What is most compelling to people? Okay, so again, find that chat window and see what your thoughts are there. And Mike has added, and what are you most comfortable doing? And sometimes what's most effective can be what you're most comfortable doing. Okay, so Carrie says that you can write or call your elected representatives. Telling stories while also providing facts and statistics from Joshua. Volunteering time, absolutely. Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, all of those are great.
If I can add something real quick
Yeah.
about volunteering time. Renee said it's not always effective. The way I look at it is you're kind of setting up a background of trust. So even if you're volunteering your time and they're not doing anything in the areas that you really are interested in or not doing much, sometimes just putting in the time makes you part of that community of folks working on that issue. So it may not pay off immediately. It might pay off in the long run because the folks that you're working with respect you and they understand that you're committed to whatever that activity is. And then in a month or a couple of years, when an issue that's very important to you comes up, you've built that foundation of trust.
Absolutely. And I think that community building aspect is often underappreciated because it's a long game. And so you might not see the payoff immediately, but just as an example, we timed this this webinar to be right after Election Day. Partly it seemed timely, but Election Day is on my mind, and because of our grassroots organizing, we were able in local elections to very effectively reach out to people to advocate for particular candidates and particular issues. And you're setting the groundwork anytime you're putting yourself out into the community. So definitely that volunteerism is important. So I just wanted to finish up the how here by giving a sort of general rule of thumb. And again, this is heavily influenced by my participation in indivisible activities, but this is really translatable beyond that particular type of grassroots efforts. And that is that the recognition that people are impressed the more effort it takes you to do whatever action it is that you have done. Obviously, there's an aspect of your expertise. And so someone said, you know, I tell stories that are grounded in data. That's effortful to find that data and to compile it in a compelling way. And so anything that is more effortful, in general, I think is very effective. I should mention also that the indivisible model is that the people who care most about this are your elected representatives. So I probably should have a bullet in here that says you should be advocating to people who represent you specifically, because that will go much farther than phone calls to someone who's in a different district who represents someone else. They're not representing you. But for your elected officials, or for your colleagues or for your neighbors, things that are effortful, that have an impact, if you show up in person. And so a lot of elected officials have or should be having in-person meetings like town halls, meet and greets. And if you are there meeting them, shaking their hands so that they know you, then that goes a long way. Writing a letter, that takes time to put that down on the computer, print it out, put postage on it. There's a level of effort involved with that, not as much as being there in person, more than a phone call, but phone calls also have an impact. And one of the advantages of phone calls is that you can do that in volume. One of my neighbors joked that she didn't make a phone call one week and she thought maybe the representative's office was worried she wasn't well because she didn't call that week. And you can do that on a daily or weekly basis of making phone calls. All of that is far more impactful than social media posts, which are so easy to do that in general, they are ignored by elected representatives. And they're easy to ignore because you can just not read them. Phone calls, even though they're relatively easy to do, have the benefit of making a noise and occupying someone's time who has to answer the phone. And so that really can make a difference. The comment was made that telling stories is valuable, and I would echo that with the second item here, making it personal, connecting to whoever you're advocating to on a real human level, both in your own humanity as well as theirs. What is it that they care about? What is it that their brand is? And what are your experiences? I think this was played to great effect with healthcare discussions where people were sharing their own healthcare experiences in advocating for preserving the Affordable Care Act, for example, or aspects of the Affordable Care Act, but really finding that human connection. Here at Princeton, there was a graduate student who was involved with Scouts for Equality, and he was among the group that helped that organization change their policies to allow for LGBTQ scouts and scout leaders to be part of the Boy Scouts of America. And what he tapped into was their stated mission of leadership and equality, and you're tapping into the values of who you're advocating to. Specific, so that data part, find the compelling data, tap into specific efforts or values of your elected officials, find the things, like I said, that they really care about. And then lastly on here is actionable. Make sure that when you're advocating, it's not just a general, could you please speak out for climate change action, but are there specific bills that you want? Are there things that you want them to vote on or co-sponsor? Are there issues related to curricula that are going to be voted on by the school board? Are there, particular budget line items that you want to see passed or not passed? In general, talk is cheap. And so if you can really get a commitment for action, that is key. Let me say one last thing about the general rule of thumb for advocacy, and that is at a local level, even though it's not as sexy, school board meetings, town council meetings, county meetings generally are poorly attended. And so showing up in person for those meetings, you can have a disproportionate impact because you are one of only a few people in the room. And so that, again, finding ways in which to be effective, that's a good way to go. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mike for what resources we have through NAGT.
Yeah, before I get to the resources, a couple of things came to my mind, and to kind of back up what Catherine said, and another thing to keep in mind is to respect the role of the people that you're talking to. So doing a little homework to understand like what their realm of responsibility is and what they can and can't do is also very helpful, because sometimes people go into advocate and they're actually asking somebody to do something that's not really within their realm to affect. So kind of respecting and understanding what it is that the person that you're talking to does. And the other thing that I suggest to people is because my wife is a rhetorician, is understanding the rhetoric. And part of the rhetoric is how you present yourself. So, you know, if you go to the Capitol building at the state or the federal level, you know, you want to dress like the professionals there. If you dress like a tourist, they're going to treat you like a tourist. If you dress like a professional, and for somebody like me, I wear a suit and a tie. My family and I went to the Capitol in DC over the summer and met with a congressperson, and we were just on vacation, but everybody took nice clothes to wear for that particular meeting. You get treated differently if you have that rhetoric, kind of that visual how you look. So anyway, sorry, that just popped into my head as we were looking at that slide. The advocacy resources, this is something that we're trying to build at NAGT. So we could go to the website and take a look if we want, but we're trying to build this out. So I would say that our website, at least at this point, is kind of in transition. There are some very useful materials there. We have some discussion boards. They haven't seen a lot of use. I'm not sure if we're going to keep those or if we would want to have the discussion somewhere else. But what's been a little more useful have been our email lists. And the email lists, there's a public policy email list and an advocacy list. Those have been very useful off and on. When something of interest arises, somebody advocates the appropriate listserv, and then the discussion can be very hot and productive for, you know, maybe a few weeks or a little bit longer. And then once that issue has been addressed, then it dies down a bit. But that seems to be have been more effective probably than the discussion boards, because that email hits your inbox and it's something to look at. We also have position statements, and this is something that we're in the process of looking at and updating. And I think that that we're probably going to add maybe a few more position statements. So, Catherine can speak to this a little bit later. But one of the things that we would really like input on would be, what other position statements should we as the NAGT adopt? And then we also have the option of adopting position statements of partner organizations. So we don't necessarily have to write our own. I mean, sometimes we do because it's something that as an organization we feel very strongly about. But the Geological Society of America, for example, has a lot of position statements, some of which are relevant to us, at least tangentially, in that we can adopt those as well. And so I think ultimately that's some stuff that you'll see on our advocacy website. So that leads us right into the next slide. which is to get you thinking about what resources would be helpful for you to have access to from the NAGT. So go ahead and type those in the chat thing, and then we can keep a record of that. Thank you, Renee.
So suggestions for climate resiliency, policies, like a position statement around that, interest and equity in these kinds of policies. I imagine that there's the issue of equity within climate resiliency, also the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion within the sciences more generally, which is a very needed area within the geosciences in particular.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Carrie's point, geoscience related bills we can support, that is probably one of the trickiest issues. In the Illinois state legislature, for example, in the current session, we're 1 year into the 2-year session, there are over, if you look at the House and the Illinois House and the Senate, we're well over 5,000 bills already. So bill tracking is a very difficult thing for us to do as an organization because we're small. We do get some assistance from the AGU, the AGI, and the GSA. And if those are just letters to you, they're geoscience organizations that actually have staff in Washington, D.C. that keep an eye on federal bills. At the state level, that's kind of where we rely on our membership. If a bill comes to your attention, it's super helpful if you forward that to Catherine, because right now she's the head of the advocacy committee. But even if you forward it to NAGT staff, then they can pass it along to the appropriate person. It is very difficult to keep track of all the bills.
Okay, so let's keep thinking about what additional resources you might want. We are just coming to the end of our last few slides. I wanted to mention a couple of resources that are beyond NAGT, but are incredibly useful. First of all, in terms of running for office, I have found, at least in my area, that there are a lot of local groups, including our county clerk, who are interested in empowering people to run for office. And so these are really kind of how-to seminars for, how to set up your treasurer, your campaign manager, so that you're legal with your local officials. And in New Jersey, that's the New Jersey Election Commission. Finding other local events and political groups that you can become a part of. And again, a lot of those will help you get your name out there, but also are running guides and are supporting candidates as they run for office. And then one group that I want to mention in particular is 314 Action, because their mission is to get more people who are scientists and engineers and mathematicians into elected office. I think the main focus is on more state and national races than local races, but nevertheless, they're a great group to reach out to if you're interested. The second set of resources that I have listed here are places where you might find data, and in particular, data related to geoscience or environmental science issues. One place that I have found great success is through the League of Conservation Voters website. They have a scorecard for elected officials in how they have voted on environment-related bills. And this was very useful for us in thinking about our previous House of Representatives official and what his actual record on the environment was. I mentioned the idea that talk is cheap, and he spoke as an environmentalist, and his League of Conservation Voters scorecard was in the 12% range out of 100. So not good. And having that data was really powerful to compel him to change. What was also powerful in working with him was looking at the bills that he had sponsored or co-sponsored. And the US Congress has a website where you can track elected officials in the bills that they have signed on to. So what are they sponsoring and what are they co-sponsoring? And the Congress actually breaks it down by category. And so our representative had sponsored, 2,000 bills in his time in Congress, and the number of environment-related bills that he had co-sponsored was 4. So again, that kind of data can be really powerful as you're advocating for different action because it's specific and it's pointing out their weaknesses. The Union of Concerned Scientists is also a fantastic organization. They do sometimes track bills. Again, as Mike was saying, at a state level, it's very difficult. On a national level, it can be a little bit easier. And so, they provide position papers or at least background papers on specific scientific issues in the policy realm. And then finally, obviously there are specific groups that advocate. I have in here Be Careful because they have a particular slant on things. And so you may not be getting the most impartial data that you could imagine. But nevertheless, some of those groups produce fantastic data. And so, that they are potential resources. Here in Princeton, we're home for Climate Central, and they produce graphs and data for general consumption, but also for meteorologists to be able to communicate the connection between weather and climate and extreme weather events and climate. So a group like that, I would, without hesitation, tap into.
There's a link that was posted by one of the participants to the bills the AGU has endorsed.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also mention AGU sponsors a Congressional Visits Day in the spring. I participated in that a few years ago. It was very, very helpful, partly because they paid for my travel to go out there, but the day before we did our congressional visits, they gave us training. They helped us, every person who went along, develop a one-page sheet to leave behind at the office. And the AGU folks set up the meeting so that we could meet with Congress people from our state and from the districts that we lived in. So they put us into small groups, but each group went to their congressperson, but not by themselves. They went with a group of other people, and we had discussed the issues that happened to be important at the time. And like I said, we developed a sheet to hand out, to leave behind, and to talk to staffers and things. So it went very, very well, and it was very good training also to help understand exactly what you need to do. So they didn't just kind of throw us into the halls of Congress and say good luck. We spent a whole day preparing before we actually went on our visits. So, and they put out that call sometime in the spring, and people just apply, and then they select from the applications and let you know. But it's definitely worth your while if you'd like to get involved, because there's a lot of support in it as well.
Absolutely, and I'll add one more thing to that, which is that last year, the American Geophysical Union meeting was in Washington, D.C., and while we were there, I called up our congressman's chief of staff and invited her to come over to the meeting, and so walked her around the poster hall for an afternoon, just answering questions. And you know, one of the things to realize about those Congress people is that their staffers are often the people who are writing bills or making policy recommendations. You might be horrified to know how many over-caffeinated 20-year-olds are actually running our policy decisions as staffers, but you can do that informally in addition to the formal AGU sponsored congressional visit days.
Well, and so building off of what Catherine said, those staffers typically have a list of areas that they're expected to work on bills for their office. So each congressperson has a small staff, and each staff person has their portfolio, which may or may not be something that they know a lot about, but they develop over time that expertise. But one of the ways that they do that is that they like to develop their own little Rolodex or list of people that they can contact. So if you can get to know the staff person that deals with your area of expertise, if they develop a relationship with you where they trust you, you might be the person that they call to know more about something when a bill comes up.
Absolutely. All right, so we are just about out of time. So I wanted to make one last pitch here. The Advocacy Committee with NAGT, we are looking for people who are interested. I think there's currently one opening. So if you are interested in being part of the Advocacy Committee, please send me an email, car3@princeton.edu. And we have just maybe 1 or 2 minutes if there are any questions or comments. I should also say that Andrew has put up a survey in the chat window for you to fill out. And I believe that he would like to just advertise the upcoming webinars.
Thanks for a great discussion and certainly lots of things to digest. So yeah, just quickly to point out that we do have another upcoming webinar in the webinar series on Tuesday, November 13th about engaging undergraduates with the data behind melting ice and changing sea levels coming out of the Geoscience project. If you are familiar with that project, fantastic use of data in the classroom. There is also, please take the webinar survey. It's on your screen right now, but I also put it in the chat box that you can click and go to there. Again, there's links here to the NAGT advocacy website and lots of other places to go there. I will also add one quick question about thoughts, and you're not gonna be able to answer it all the time, but thoughts about advocacy and integrating it into the classroom, right? We've been talking about it from like an individual basis, but what else could we be doing in the classroom? And I'll leave it up there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Andrew. And I believe that there are NAGT resources through Teach the Earth about teaching controversial topics. And so, you know, obviously not all of these issues I would view as controversial. There are also resources for teaching with data. And, you know, my general approach with issues like climate change is to let the data speak for itself, and make it clear, you know, I have a view, but here's why, and it's grounded in the data that's available. So if you go to the NAGT Teach the Earth portal, you can find some of those resources there.
Yeah, one of the things that I do is in a couple of my classes, I have students around election time develop questions related to our course. My environmental science course, I do this every year almost. I have them develop as a class 3 questions that they would like to ask candidates, and then each student is assigned a candidate and they research and find out where that candidate stands on those 3 issues and report back to class. It empowers the students. It helps them understand exactly how to go about getting that information. And that's with our students. One of the reasons why they don't vote is because they're not sure who they're voting for or what they stand for. So giving them that tool and encouraging them to do a little bit of research, and they can kind of understand how to do that, makes it, I think, a little more likely that they'll actually go out and start to participate.
That's fantastic. So just to keep track with time, we are at the end of the hour. So I just want to thank Catherine and Mike again for such a great discussion, and look forward to having all of you guys interact with the Advocacy Committee in NAGT.
Great, thank you. And there is a comment from Renee. So Renee, I'll reach out to you personally.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.